to our event for today. Our Fall Forum theme is Creative and Critical Thinking, Exploring Multiple Perspectives in the Classroom. And just to share a little bit of background on this for you, this theme emerged from conversations with our colleagues in the Liberal Studies program. We realized in having conversations about our core curriculum here at DePaul that we have many courses that are concerned with getting students to think critically and creatively in order to begin questioning their prior assumptions and to move beyond their familiar frameworks. So we thought this would be a theme that would resonate with many of you, regardless of what disciplines or backgrounds you might be teaching in here at DePaul. So we decided that we would take this half day together to discuss how we can facilitate this kind of deep learning in our classrooms. So my hope for you today is that you will find this stimulating, but ultimately that you will find it helpful to your teaching. So without any further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for the day, Dr. Stephen Brookfield. Dr. Brookfield is a distinguished university professor from the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Dr. Brookfield is a leading scholar on critical and creative thinking and adult learning. I know he already knows many of you in the room from his work in those areas. He has published 15 books on teaching, adult learning, critical thinking, discussion methods, and critical theory, several of which are award-winning. His most recent book published this year is this one here, Teaching for Critical Thinking, Tools and Techniques to Help Students Question Their Assumptions. And this will inform his talk with us today as he joins us to model ways for exploring alternative perspectives in the classroom and also shares teaching techniques that encourage creative and critical thinking by our students. Dr. Brookfield will take questions at the end of his talk, and his book is also for sale in the lobby if you're interested. Please help me welcome Dr. Stephen Brookfield.
Now the audio. Whoa. Or I can always use one of the handheld mics if need be.
We're going to be good.
How does that? That's still slightly feedbacking. Is there a weird? That sounds okay. Is that good? Great. Thank you. Well, welcome to this morning's event. We have a Twitter feed up, so I'm encouraging you as we go through the next hour or two, if there are questions that you have or comments you want to make or responses, reactions, disagreements, if you tweet TC5815, that's the hashtag TC5815, they will appear on the screen over here. And so I will be able to just check in every few minutes and see if there is something coming up. I'm now in the habit of doing this in all my classes, so I think that one of the tweets that's up there, I didn't pay someone to put up, "Love these techniques, great class," or whatever the comment is, but that comes from my class back in Minneapolis on Tuesday night this week. Also, I wanted to mention my homepage, stephenbrookfield.com, because I have all my classroom resources and activities up there. So if I mention something, a particular technique this morning, you will find it on my homepage for free download. So there's no need to ask me for permission to use anything on the homepage. Just go on there and steal whatever looks good, and with my blessing. So it's not stealing. It's what is that? It's I guess a gift I'm giving. Sounds a little bit portentous, giving you the gift of my homepage. But anyway, just go on there and take anything that looks helpful. I think a good teacher is like a good cat burglar. You can enter a house or enter a classroom and very quickly work out what's going to be valuable to you. And so I love to watch colleagues teach and steal from them and adapt to my own settings. So stephenbrookfield.com is the homepage. And then if you want some music while you're looking at my homepage, go to my band, the 99ers, or visit us on Facebook and listen to us. We're on iTunes. We have 4 albums out on Spin Out Records, which is based in Nashville, Tennessee, but we don't play country. We play kind of punk rock mixed with rockabilly. So the 99ers. So usually at something like this, I try and kick things off just by giving you a little bit of a sense of who I am as a teacher. And I think that for me, and I suspect that for many of us in this room, who we are as teachers is significantly framed by who we have been as learners. And I know the way that I teach is very much linked to my own autobiography as a student. And I feel as a university teacher, I'm very lucky in that I have a history of not being a very good student. So when I'm working with students who tell me they don't get it, who are struggling, I feel that experientially I'm in a much better position to help them than if I had just aced my own undergraduate and graduate work. So, for example, when I got to age 18 in England, where I grew up, and it came to applying for university, I failed a whole third of my high school completion exams. So the places that had been provisionally offered to me at universities were all withdrawn, and I couldn't go to college, which was a shame because I really wanted to. I didn't want to stay at home any longer. I was ready to get out into the world. Unfortunately, there was a family friend who was in education, and he said to us, there is this new College of Technology which has just put on an experimental interdisciplinary degree course, and they're really desperate for people. So you should apply. And they were really desperate, and it seemed like the main qualification for acceptance was if you could find the interview room, then you were in. So I found the room and I was in. So I actually got onto an undergraduate degree program when I really shouldn't. But I didn't do very well. In the second year, I was called in by the dean and told I really had to kind of sharpen up. I managed to complete the degree, but I finished in, there were 4 quadrants and I was in the 3rd, so I was consistently, solidly below average. And I really wanted to go to graduate school because graduate school put off the decision for work, and I was having a great social time as a student. I loved the lifestyle of being a student. But there was no way I could get into a master's program because my degree was so poor. So I actually called up one of the universities that had rejected me and spoke to the departmental secretary and told her, I feel it's really unfair for universities to exclude you based on paper and pencil tests. They don't really capture the totality of who you are as a person and as a student. And she took sympathy on me and arranged an interview with me with the head of the department, even though the university had formally rejected me. And that was an early lesson of the importance of departmental secretaries, who are really like the conduit for information and the person often that students feel is a sympathetic ear in a way that faculty with their positional power and authority often aren't. So she arranged this interview, and what I am good at is negotiating political systems. So I thought the way I'm going to get into this program is if I can find out something about the head of department and work the interview in a way that will convince him that I share his intellectual preoccupations and interests, And I found out that this guy actually had a burning hatred of a particular theoretician. So I went in and I did an excoriating critique of this particular person, and I was in the program. But unfortunately, it was a master's that was by examination. So and at the end of 2 years, I failed my master's exam. And one of the very few, the only person I know in the history of the program to fail that exam. So the profs held a special kind of tribunal, invited me in, and said, we will give you the summer. And if you can conceive of and execute in the next kind of 8 weeks a paper of 30,000 words, it was a long, like a mini thesis, then we will consider giving you the degree, even though you fail the exam. And I was able to do that. Because for me as a learner, the thing that I've always struggled with is taking tests and taking examinations. But if you give me the freedom to control, to some degree, where I'm going, the pace at which I'm going, so I feel that I'm in charge of the learning process, I always do better. But ask me to take a pen and paper test or any kind of standardized test, closed book exam, and I just freeze and my mind goes a blank. It doesn't matter how long I have studied for this. I'm hopeless at taking exams, which means, I think, that I'm probably one of the best faculty to prepare students who are having problems taking exams, because I know what it feels like to be in that situation. So when I was at Columbia, I was at Columbia University in New York for 10 years, at Teachers College. I volunteered to teach the class preparing the doctoral students for their candidacy exams, because I felt I was, in a good experiential position to do that. And so one thing my autobiography as a learner has given me as a teacher is a sympathy for students who struggle with examinations, and a desire, as much as possible, to stretch and widen and subvert some of the increasingly closed evaluation systems that we find ourselves under. The other thing I'd just say quickly by way of introduction is that the only time I really liked being a student was in my doctoral education in England, and I applied to do a doctorate because I knew the place I was working at was going to be closed down sooner or later, and I thought if I'm enrolled in a doctoral program, this will, make me more marketable. And in England, it's very different from over here. Usually, to get into a doctoral program, you just convince someone at a local university that you have a good idea. And if they like your idea, they agree to take you on. And the program is meeting that person every 6 weeks or so, having a conversation with him or her, deciding what you're going to do for the next 6 weeks, going away, doing it, come back and having another conversation. And then at the end of 3 years, my advisor took me out for lunch, and that was the defense. So it was very relaxed, and I felt like I was in control of a lot of what was going on. But the interesting thing about my doctoral experience was that my advisor gave me a lot of bad news during the process. He would tell me I was going wrong. Right at the start of our time together, he told me my methodology was that I was proposing was completely inappropriate for the problem that I was looking at. My methodology was a statistically oriented one, and because that's what I'd done for my special paper that I did, to get my master's degree, he said, this doesn't fit what you're looking at. You have to do this new thing called grounded theory. It shows how long ago this is. And when he told me that, I didn't feel like he was making me jump through a meaningless hoop or he was exercising arbitrary power over me. I felt he was doing it in my own best interests. So over that 3 years, one of the things I was really interested in is, how is it that an educator with power and authority over you can give you bad news and really coerce you to do things that initially you didn't want to do, but do it in a way which feels supportive and which feels that that person has your own best interest at heart. So I became really interested in the whole relational dimension to teaching and learning, and the way that trust is built between us as instructors and our students, and particularly how important that dynamic is whenever we're asking them to do something that is threatening or different or intimidating, which I think thinking creatively and critically both entail. So that's just a little bit of autobiographical background. So let me move into just saying a few things about critical thinking so you understand what my own understanding of that concept is about. And then as we go through the morning, we'll look at how students experience it, what particular approaches and techniques you might want to consider incorporating into your own teaching, and maybe we'll have a chance to try out a couple of things in the session this morning. So this is how typically I explain critical thinking to students. It's the process by which we become aware of the assumptions that frame the ways we think about scholarship and knowledge and those abstract things we learn in college, but also the way we think about life decisions, and the assumptions that frame the way that we act. So our decisions, our actions, our judgments, choices in life are based on sets of assumptions that we have. And critical thinking is an attempt to identify those and then to check out whether those assumptions are accurate, whether they fit the situation, whether they're valid, whether the assumptions we make about what legitimate scholarship looks like really are well grounded. And then the point of it is to allow us to take informed action. So the only reason you do critical thinking is to prepare you to take more informed actions. The creative thinking, I think someone who thinks creatively is able to view ideas and practices from multiple viewpoints, so is used to moving outside of their habitual, typical, mental framework. They can generate interpretations and perspectives and responses that are different from the mainstream, the generic, the broadly accepted, taken for granted modes of thinking or practice. And someone who, I think, who can think creatively is able to communicate that thought and these first two practices through a variety of different ways: visual, graphic, kinetic, symbolic, auditory, so on and so forth. So when I'm using critical thinking, I'm talking about the focus on understanding and checking out assumptions. And when I'm talking about creative thinking, I'm emphasizing more the ability to look at things from multiple viewpoints and have multiple responses to familiar ideas and practices. And behind both of these ideas is the point of them is to take an informed action. So for me, a critically and creatively informed action meets these conditions. It's based on evidence or experience that can be justified, it's had its assumptions checked, stands a good chance of achieving what you hope that it will achieve. It's been viewed from multiple perspectives, and the action is enacted, is put into action in multiple ways through multiple modalities. Just a couple of more general kind of definitions of terms, and then I want to concretize this in terms of specific examples. When I'm introducing students to the idea of critical thinking, I'm using the word assumptions a great deal. And I've found that it's often helpful early on to establish what different kinds of assumptions students are likely to encounter. So this is a threefold classification I use a lot: causal assumptions, prescriptive assumptions, and paradigmatic. Causal assumptions are the typical ones that we most commonly uncover, I think, in classrooms. They're assumptions we make about cause and effect. So if I do this, if I set up an experiment this particular way, my assumption is that it will result in this particular outcome. If I'm trying to understand a sequence of historical events, I'm going to explain it by a causal chain. This happened, which caused that happened, and so on and so forth. So, and I think causal assumptions are something that we as instructors use all the time. For example, this morning, I started off the presentation a few minutes ago by making an autobiographical disclosure of my time as a student. That is based on the causal assumption that doing that draws people into a presentation in a more engaging way than going straight to an abstract definition of terms. We have you seated at round tables here. It's a causal assumption that this will make small group conversation more amenable and congenial when we move into that. Prescriptive assumptions, the second category, a little bit harder to get at, but these are the assumptions that we have, I think, as scholars and teachers, and that students have, about what good scholarship should look like, what a good researcher, scholar, teacher does in this discipline. So a good sociologist thinks this way, a good art historian thinks this way, a good teacher should engage students in this way. So a prescriptive assumption is they're the kinds of things embedded in mission statements, codes of practice, and they usually have the word should lurking in there somewhere. And then paradigmatic assumptions are the hardest ones, in my experience, to get students to uncover. These are the framing, structuring assumptions that just frame the whole way that you look at a subject area or a particular topic. And they're so deeply embedded that when someone says to us, well, this is an assumption you're working under, we usually respond by saying that's not an assumption, that's the way the world is. So a paradigmatic assumption is a kind of common sense, taken for granted one, and the most difficult to get students to look at. And for me, the most difficult ones for me to look at, as we'll see in a moment. And then just a final background to this. I think one of the problems with critical thinking is that when we use this term, we're working from the viewpoint of different intellectual traditions. So you can be, I've been on task forces in critical thinking at my own university, and it's become fairly clear pretty quickly that when we use this term, we're sometimes working with very different understandings of what it is and how you recognize it in students. The four most common traditions, I think, that feed into critical thinking are the ones on the screen. The strongest is the analytic philosophy one, which says a student who thinks critically is good at constructing and deconstructing arguments, knows the difference between inferential and analogical reasoning, knows what induction and deduction is, can recognize logical fallacies. So they're good at playing language games, constructing and deconstructing arguments. I think this is by far the most predominant tradition in American higher education, the analytic philosophy and logic tradition. A second one, I think, is the natural science tradition, which says that, critical thinking is basically the application of the scientific method, the hypothetico-deductive method, where you look at a range of phenomena and you generate, which is a creative process, you creatively generate what seems like a likely hypothesis to explain this process, and then you set up an experiment and you confirm or refute or you modify the hypothesis, and if necessary, do another experimentation and so on. And you're working under the principle of falsifiability, Karl Popper's idea that for something to be scientifically valid, it must be open to being disproved. So the way that a lot of scientific knowledge is created is the attempt to disprove, and whatever is left after that attempt is knowledge that you can have some confidence in. The third intellectual tradition, less, I think, prevalent, is the tradition of critical theory, which says that a critical thinker is someone who has a heightened political consciousness, who is very alert to the way that power moves within this society and also moves within micro realities of families and peer groups and communities and workplaces. And a critical thinker is someone who can be alert to ideological manipulation when they are being brainwashed with dominant ideology without an awareness of that's happening. Now, my university, our mission statement is to help students become more critical thinkers. I don't think by that they mean students who can detect ideological manipulation. I work at a fairly conservative. You can't be fairly Catholic. You're either Catholic or not, as you know. And then the final tradition is the one, I think, which most intersects with creativity, the tradition of American pragmatism, which says, a critical thinker is someone who sees knowledge as something that's constantly reinvented. We're open to new ways of thinking, new ways of practicing. We value experimenting. So, the best teacher from the pragmatic tradition is someone who is open constantly to changing up what they do each semester based on new information they're getting from their students. So we're open to new experiences and to reinventing what we do. We're engaged in the experimental and creative pursuit of beautiful consequences, such as democracy, inclusion, or creating connections. I did some work with the Occupy Wall Street movement, the National Facilitation Committee, and with some of the groups around the country, and got a great kick out of one group, Occupy Bellingham, out in Washington, whose T-shirt says, Occupy Bellingham, the experimental pursuit of beautiful consequences, Brookfield and Holst underneath, because that comes from a book that I wrote a couple of years ago with a colleague called John Holst. So that was really nice. So that's the opening projectile vomit of terms and background and so on that I'm going to be working with as we move now more into the practice elements and try and concretize some of this. Is there anything up on the Twitter feed that you want to mention, Rani? That
Yeah, there are a handful there I would mention. Bob tweeted out that before one can identify or examine, one has to have a position toward knowledge that requires such practices. Matthew shared that paradigmatic assumptions are often what he's most interested in having students examine. And then there are a couple questions that were raised.
Let me just respond to those two. I do think that critical thinking is not something that happens in a vacuum. So in order for students to think critically, they need to have learned often a basic grammar of their subject. The epistemological grammar, how is it that we know scholars in this area decide that something is truthful, and also the content grammar, the kind of building blocks of the knowledge. To ask students to think critically about something before they have an initial engagement with it is really, I think, very, very difficult. And the paradigmatic ones, those are the assumptions that I think are those most deeply embedded, yes, are the most interesting ideological assumptions to get at. And I'm actually going to look at a couple of these in a moment. And then what were the questions?
Well, one related to those paradigmatic assumptions was, what are the relations of power when it comes to paradigmatic assumptions?
Yep. And the other?
And the other was, and you may be getting to this, so I may be jumping ahead, but how do you determine what your students' assumptions are approaching a particular course or topic?
Great. The power one we will move into right now. The determining where students are, what they bring to new learning in terms of existing assumptions we will get to in a little bit. So thank you. Those are nice tasters for where we're going. So let me root this whole process now, move it away from something abstract and ground it in my own experiences. And I'm going to give two examples of critical thinking and creative thinking as it relates to something that's very personal to me. And this, I think, speaks to the notion of paradigmatic assumptions and the notion of power. I'm not the only person in this room who suffers from clinical depression. There will be probably 3 or 4 others, at least, who are really struggling with it right now, and several more who are living with or related to or good friends with people who are struggling with it. So for me, this is something that's been a constant thing for me, particularly in my adult life. And at times, you know, not to get too dramatic about this, but a good day has been one where I didn't feel suicidal. That's how I would measure a good day. And I would often think, how on earth am I going to get through the next 15 minutes or the next hour? And my wife would give me tasks for the next 15 minutes or the next hour. And the high point of the day was taking Ambien because I knew that would knock me out for 5 hours. So I've suffered from this, and for many, many years, I just didn't do anything about it. Well, I did something about it, but I did the wrong thing about it. I was working under some assumptions about the nature of clinical depression. One, that depression is caused by external circumstances. So that if you're depressed, it must be because something's wrong. You've lost someone close to you, let's say. You've just been fired. You've been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Since my life is great, then I had no reason to be depressed. Therefore, I wasn't really depressed, was my way of thinking. Secondly, if I ever admitted that I was depressed, my assumption about the best way to deal with this, the causal assumption, was that you reason your way through it, you tell yourself to snap out of it, and that does it. You know, come on, Stephen. This is ridiculous. You have no need or reason to be depressed, snap out of it. And thirdly, I would never consider medication because medication are for those people who are weak, who can't really deal with the world, who are in retreat from the world. So taking medication is a sign of weakness. So, you know, why did these assumptions have such a hold on me and wreck my life for so long? Well, I think because they are rooted in a paradigmatic, ideological assumption of patriarchy. I think I was working in a very patriarchal, or living in a very patriarchal way. If you told me, if you'd said to me, you know, Stephen, you're caught in patriarchy, I would have said, no way, I'm such an evolved male. I have moved far beyond the Neanderthal understandings of patriarchy. But I think that's what was going on. I had so successfully imbued this way of viewing the world. And I just wasn't aware of it. So my understanding of how I would define patriarchy is that, men, because they're superior in terms of their rational, objective capability compared to women who are moved by emotion and compassion, and we love and value them for it, of course, poor dears. Men, because of their superior objective rationality and logic, ultimately that's where the decision-making should reside. And I really do think that patriarchy was stopping me getting help, was stopping me considering medications, was causing me to feel great shame because I continued to be depressed. Once I kind of started to realize this and understand, I'm ensnared in patriarchy, then that was a sort of breakthrough insight for me, which my wife really helped me understand. And then I was able to switch paradigms over a period of time and with help, and start to realize a counter viewpoint, which is, I was in New York a couple of weeks ago, and on 71st and Broadway, there's this billboard which says, "Depression is a flaw in chemistry, not a flaw in personality." So I borrowed that for this. And then to think that as well as, rational thinking, creatively, there are other ways, other modalities of dealing with depression. There is medication, there is meditation, there is music, and for me, those three things have been crucial, especially the first, in helping me deal with this situation. Here's the second example. This has to do with assumptions I have around my own racial identity. I've grown up thinking that I am free of racism, I don't see color or race, and I treat everybody the same. And anytime I would be challenged on that, I would very predictably react with a sort of firestorm of, what do I want to say, of rejecting it, saying, no, you just misunderstood what I was saying, or I haven't explained myself properly, or what you need to know about what I did in this situation is this, and that information. And I think my strong belief in this color blindness, fair, empathetic, free of racism set of assumptions I had about myself, again, are rooted in an ideology. This time, not patriarchy we're looking at, but white supremacy. The ideology that the norm for leadership is white, because whites, partly because they work from a European, Eurocentric tradition of objectively thinking through and logically analyzing problems, and that if you're white, you're not a racial being, others are racial beings, you are white, you're the norm, you're not raced, others are raced, and that you can escape any racism by a kind of moral determination, by just saying, I'm going to watch and check myself, and that will take care of the problem. And for me, it's been a very long and continuing to be a long and arduous process to question some of those assumptions and explore a counter view and a more creative approach to this. The counter view being that we are, of course, as whites, raced, I am raced, that I frequently engage in racial microaggressions, small acts of exclusion in meetings, things that I say, body language, gestures, eye contact or lack of it, which students I call on in class, and that higher education is already racialized. This is using Lucius Outlaw's notion of racialization, that a field of inquiry or study is always viewed through a particular racial group's lens. What would it look like to apply creativity to this? Well, I think that would be saying, what would higher ed look like? What would my classrooms, what would my curriculum, my content, my forms of assessment and evaluation look like if we work from a different racialized tradition. So if it was racialized in favor of African Americans, in favor of indigenous people, in favor of Latino, Latina, in favor of the Asian diaspora, whatever. So for me, both my depression and my working with students and colleagues of other races are both good examples where, even though I think I'm focused on thinking critically and creatively, I'm still caught very much in deep paradigmatic assumptions which clearly represent power relationships in the wider society around gender relationships and around racial relationships. Anything on the tweet? No, nothing new. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is get us all to do something. I want to move into looking at this whole question of what it is that helps students think both critically and creatively. And I'm going to ask you to think about this question, and in a moment to share some responses at tables using a particular protocol that I find very adaptable across curricular settings and disciplinary settings. It's this particular process, the circle of voices. This is typically a small group activity I'll do early on in a semester, where students work in groups of about 5. And what happens with Circle of Voices is that you announce the question to the class, and in this case, our question is, what most helps your students to think critically and/or creatively? And you give them a minute or so of silent time just to think and make some notes about this, written or mental notes. Then in groups of 5, there's 2 rounds of conversations. The first round, you go around the group and each person takes their turn to give their response to the question that they've thought about in the opening minute. And as they're giving their response, the ground rule is no interruptions. So it's like 5 mini monologues of about a minute each. Once everybody has done that, then you move into free discussion, but this time a second ground rule comes into effect, which is you can only talk about what somebody else said in the opening round. So in this second round of open discussion, you can only talk about what somebody else said in the opening round, which can be disagreements, questions, elaborations that you give, or extensions and illustrations and so on. So I'd like us to try this just for 5 minutes or so. Here's the question again, and I'm going to ask, would you just think about this for a minute or so, make some notes on it, and then I will call time and we'll move into the circle of voices in a minute. Okay. So if we could have a report from each small group reporter. Just kidding. So the question was, what most helps students to think critically and creatively? And I'm sure there were lots of ideas that were exchanged at table. And the reason I asked you to talk about this was so that you would have a chance to reflect on the sorts of things that came up as examples of practices that help students think critically and creatively, the things that came from your experience in terms of how they compared to what research on student engagement says that students find, that what is it that students say helps them think creatively and critically. And there are some really interesting findings here. The most interesting to me being the one at the top, that by far the greatest number of responses on this question is students saying, seeing you model it for us. Seeing an instructor publicly engage in critical thinking and be very intentional about describing to students, that's what I'm now doing. So naming the process of critical thinking. How does this happen? Well, I'm going to talk about some of the practices that are most frequently talked about. Number one, some sort of modeling of soliciting feedback from students on a regular basis, and then as teachers thinking about what does this feedback mean for our teaching of this class. The critical incident questionnaire is an example of this. Well, I'll talk about that in a moment. Doing assumptions inventories. Assumptions inventories are where we stop regularly and say, okay, here's the assumptions that I've heard expressed in the discussion in the last 10 minutes or so. Let's look and see which of these assumptions are well grounded in the material that we've been studying or that link back to earlier units. Which assumptions do we feel are the strongest that we are exploring, which need to be challenged and looked at more. Where we as teachers say, here's some of the assumptions that I'm operating under as I approach this, as I've been responding to your questions in this or that way, I've been operating under this assumption, that assumption. Ending presentations, discussions, and exercises with questions. So instead of finishing off a seminar or a presentation saying, well, here's what we've looked at, and let's just recap the things that you really need to know about this. What you do instead is say, here's what's unfinished about this. Here's the unanswered questions that we really need to explore more deeply in this area. Here are the questions that our discussion has raised for us today that we could maybe use as an introduction to our next time together or to guide the discussion as we go through the semester. Doing this initially drives students crazy because they want the I's dotted and the T's crossed. But after a while, they sort of get used to this being the nature of scholarship in higher ed. Using things like chalk talk to hold a visual discussion of topics in class. Chalk talk's an exercise that I stole from Hilton Smith, who worked with the Foxfire Fund in Appalachia. It's a very adaptable exercise. What happens is that you write a question on a whiteboard or on a blackboard, or if you don't have a board in the room, I sometimes cover a wall with newsprint. And then you bring all the students to the blackboard or whiteboard, and you tell them we're now going to have silence for the next 5 minutes. But just write your responses to the question directly onto the blackboard or the whiteboard. And typically you get 4 or 5, 6 students writing at the same time. Those who are not writing, you say your job is to look for connections between the posts that are going up, to draw lines when you see connections, or to draw lines connecting maybe 2 comments that seem opposed to each other. If you have a question about something that someone has posted, write your question directly onto the blackboard or the whiteboard. In about 5 minutes, I've done this an awful lot. I've never had anything less than about 70% of participation from the class. The biggest group I've done this with is 125. I had a class of 125. A year or so ago, and would do chalk talk with them. And it was a bit unwieldy, but really in 5 or 6 minutes, you hear from a great majority of the class, and then I tell everybody, get out your phones, take pictures of the board, we'll post them on Blackboard tonight, and then we'll kind of return to these as we go through the next few weeks looking at the unit that the question is related to. A critical incident questionnaire I mentioned already. This is a brief evaluation tool that I use in my classes. I give this out once a week in the last class of the week. Takes about 5 minutes. 5 questions about when you were most engaged as a learner this week, what moment you were most distanced, action that was most helpful, the action that anybody in the room took that was most confusing in class, and what surprised you most. By the way, all this stuff is on my homepage, so just go to the workshop materials link on stephenbrookfield.com, or there's a direct link to the critical incident questionnaire. You can download it for free and use it. This is anonymous. Students fill it out. Someone collects the forms for me, hands them to me. I go home, read through them, look for themes that are mentioned by at least 10% of the class. And then I just give a report the next time we get together. Here's some of the things that you said were most engaging moments, most distancing moments, most helpful actions, most puzzling actions. If there's something that I need to work and negotiate with the class, we do that then. But it is a negotiation, it's not a capitulation. So if 90% of the class has said the most distanced moment is when you asked us to question an assumption, or the most puzzling action is why you're stressing critical thinking. So basically the class is saying enough with the critical thinking, tell us what we need to know. I'll say no, I'm not going to do that. But I need to re-justify why I won't budge, and see if there are ways that we can negotiate that maybe you can show me you're thinking critically in ways that I haven't thought of. Some other things, consistently providing real-world illustrations and examples. I mean, that seems like sort of a no-brainer. The more connections you can draw between abstract material to specific examples or illustrations. The instructor point, counterpoint. This is why if, in his second term, if President Obama ever appoints me as the czar of higher ed and says you have unlimited money to do whatever you want to, first thing I will do is say all courses are team taught, unless there's a really strong reason why that shouldn't be the case. Because seeing us engage in a critical conversation in front of them, telling them we're really trying to tease out each other's assumptions, explore alternative perspectives, model critical and creative thinking in front of them is enormously helpful. If you can't team teach, then you can engage in a structured devil's advocacy, which is a solo point counterpoint, where, let's say this is a classroom, I would present an argument from here, and then after 5 minutes or so, I would move to another part of the room and look back at myself and say, Stephen, some of the evidence that you neglected to mention because I think it's inconvenient for your position is such and such. Some of the assumptions that your argument seems to be based on, which I really think you need to investigate a little more closely, are so and so. Here is an ethical issue that you very neatly glossed over, but actually is central to what you're talking about. Here is an alternative theoretical or analytical understanding that seriously challenges your position. So seeing that spatially modeled in a point-counterpoint way, students say helpful. The speaking in tongues, this goes to the idea creatively of letting students know there are multiple ways of understanding the same piece of material, the same idea, the same practice, the same content. It's not literally speaking in tongues. What this means is that, let's say there are 3 different interpretations that are important students understand. You post 3 signs around the room. Each of them represents interpretation A, B, and C. And then when you're explaining those three interpretations, you go and stand under the sign. And when you're standing under each of those signs, you only speak in the tongue, in the language that sign represents. And when students raise a question to you, you can answer the question speaking under this theoretical framework and give the response, and then go over to another theoretical framework and give the answer from here. The what do you think, Professor moment when students say, okay, you're asking us to tell you what we think, but what do you think about this? One nice way I've seen of dealing with this, and I've borrowed this as well, borrowed this from a professor in Virginia, is that she said, well, I'm going to give you two answers. One of them represents what I think, and one of them is pure fiction. And so she sort of gives answer A from here, and an answer B from here. And then the class votes with their feet, and everyone who thinks it's answer A is what the professor thinks goes there, answer B goes there. She gives them about 5 minutes just to exchange why you think it's answer A, why you think it's answer B, and then holds a discussion with them. Okay, tell me why B, tell me why A, and then she says, well, actually it was B, or actually it was A, which I thought is a really nice way of drawing students into doing some critical and creative analysis while at the same time answering their question. If you use discussion a lot, a couple of things that I like to experiment with, and these are, if you want instructions for doing these, go to the workshop materials page, link on my home page, and scroll down to the discussion as a way of teaching file. You'll find directions for drawing discussion and musicalizing discussion. This is where you give students a discussion question, and then instead of talking about it individually, they draw it, their response to the question, for a few minutes, and then in small groups they share their drawings and come up with a group drawing that represents the discussion. The musicalizing, you have to have a group who really trusts you to be able to do this. But if you've been working with a group for a while and they're up for it, this is wonderful. So I bring in kazoos, tambourines. I'm not talking about amplifiers or Gibson guitars or saxophones or anything. Just really small, castanets, a lot of percussion instruments. And you give students a question, and it has to be one where the response can somehow be represented in a musical form. And sometimes students take a current popular song and rewrite the lyrics, or they come up with some sort of musical depiction of this. Students also say it's very helpful to us if critical thinking and creative thinking is introduced to us incrementally, so that you begin with learning a basic way of thinking that's applied to material that's relatively safe and non-threatening, and then over the quarter or over a program, you move us closer and closer to a point where we're now having to think critically and creatively about our own direct ideas. And that's been very helpful to me, because I think I've not been aware of that incremental nature of how critical and creative thinking is learned. And instead, I've started with students' experiences rather than understanding that from their viewpoint, that's where they need to end, we need to end up, but there needs to be a sort of scaffolding period where we learn how to do this around material which is relatively unchallenging. And then the more familiar we get with the process, then you up the ante and really start to probe some very basic experiences. And finally, another couple of other things. A good way to get students to think critically and creatively is to engineer a disorienting dilemma in class, a situation that takes them by surprise, reverses or upends the expectations they bring about the subject matter or how it's going to be studied. These are some of the ways. A dangerous disclosure, appropriately dangerous disclosure, a personal disclosure about something that is appropriate and introduces the students to a new facet of who you are, can sometimes do this. Changing the classroom geography can do this. Teaching from Siberia. Ira Shore says in every classroom in American higher ed, there is a zone of Siberia that students assign themselves to. Siberia is the part of the room furthest away from the teacher. But unlike the old Soviet Union, students are not exiled there. They go there voluntarily. And I know just what he means because in my faculty meetings, I always head for Siberia. I want the chair by the door so that I can get on with some work while we're going through this charade of having to show up for a meeting. And I can exit early without anybody really noticing. So, you know, when you show up in an auditorium and everyone's seated in the back 2 rows, Shaw says, just go and teach from there, change the geography and teach from Siberia. And that's where you will stand, not at the front of the auditorium. Clashing contradictions, where you present 2 very clear opposites which surprise students in a productive way. One of the things when I'm looking at notions of democracy I love to do is to give a definition by Friedrich Engels, co-author of the Communist Manifesto with Karl Marx, of democracy. And just give the quote and not say who it comes from, and students will say, you know, this is Jefferson or whomever. And I say, actually, then it's from Friedrich Engels' essay on socialism. And it presents a nice, mini disorienting dilemma. Teaching in ways which don't involve speech, I think, is another way of creating a disorienting dilemma. So using something like the chalk talk, that visual way of teaching I described already, the musicalizing discussion, graphic, symbolic, and kinetic. These are the kinds of things as a student I hate when a teacher says to me, I want you kinetically to reshape your body to represent this concept. That's usually when I run to the bathroom. But it's very much, I think, a disorienting dilemma. And importantly, having silence as a normal part of a classroom, getting away from the privileging of speech. So, for example, in the Circle of Voices, there was a mandatory period of a minute's silence. Because why should learning always, favor those extroverts who learn through verbal processing? There are many people, and I would include myself amongst them, who need reflective quiet to mull over and process and think. So I'm going to kind of end my formal remarks there and maybe take some responses, have a look at the Twitter feed in a moment, to see how the things that you raised in groups about what you think helps students think creatively and critically compare to these sorts of things that, if you look at literature on student engagement, says is important. So with that, let's have a Quaker moment of introspective reflection, even though we're not at a Quaker institution. And when the Spirit moves you, just kind of raise your hand or